You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The New Age movement isn't just about crystals, suburban yoga studios, dubious medical cures, and positive affirmations, though there's plenty of all of that to be found on YouTube. The concept of changing your mindset, accessing a higher spiritual power or vibration, and ushering in a utopia is a powerful and enduring promise that emerges again and again in American history. And the American New Age movement has deep ties to Washington State and the West. Journalist Leah Sottile examined the history of several spiritualists and New Age leaders, some may say cult leaders, in a new book published earlier this year. It's called Blazing Eye Sees All, subtitled Love Has Won, False Prophets, and the Fever Dream of the American New Age. And she's here with more. Leah Sottile, welcome to Soundside.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I think listeners have some preconceived notion about what a New Age spiritualist is or what the New Age movement looks like. But can you kind of define what it is to you, having written this book?
Yeah, so when I set out to write this book, I think even I didn't realize how just huge the term New Age or metaphysical really is. So I think it's really a big catch-all term. You could put yoga under it, you could put crystals under it, channeling, psychics, mediums. There's a lot of different ideas and practices, but also a range of belief systems. So for me, I think the best way to describe it is really a common belief that a good age is ahead, that our brightest days are ahead. So, you hear about some like religious ideologies that are apocalyptic, like there's only doom and gloom ahead. This is really the flip side of that, we are trying to better ourselves personally for a larger societal betterment and the betterment of humankind.
And you describe organizations like movements like Love Has Won, which is the group that many people might have seen in an HBO documentary recently, where they were sort of gathered around their spiritual leader who had died and basically become a mummy. Like it had, gotten to that point in Colorado. I think when you talk about that optimism and yet the direction that many of these groups move to does get really dark and really controlling. I mean, where do you think that disconnect happens? Is it just too much consolidation with one personality?
I think so. I think that's exactly it. So for me, it was interesting to write this book because I was coming off, 8, 9 years of writing about far right extremism. And I was explicitly trying to kind of get away from that and write something a little bit different. What this book became, though, was me sort of unintentionally stepping backwards into another story of extremism. I was really surprised to see that so many of these, like, specifically female gurus over the New Age history had really similar ideas to some of the people that I'd written about on the far right. So I think that there's a couple of ways to answer your question. I mean, there's this long lineage of really kind of controlling toxic belief systems. But then, like with Love Has Won, that really is a group that the entire belief system was centered on thinking that this one woman named Amy Carlson, who her followers called her Mother God, was the center of the belief system. So without her in it, that group kind of falls apart. But I think that that's part of it, is these leaders who say, I have all the answers to all the questions.
How did your experience reporting on radicalism in the West and kind of far-right extremism in the West inform the way you approached the New Age movement?
I think in some ways, when I pitched this project, like I said, it was sort of like I realized how broad it was and I needed to narrow it down in some way. And I was really interested in this idea of female power, that within the New Age movement, there are women who have claimed spiritual power that they can't really in other mainstream religions. So that was really interesting to me. But it kind of helped me choose what to write about and what not to write about. So for example, there's no yoga in this book. That could be a whole thing on its own. But where I think my experience as an extremism reporter came in was when I would dig into the ideologies of these women. I started to see just really how similar they were to many far-right figures I've written about, specifically within the militia movement and the anti-government movement. A lot of people with the same conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world and the weather and things like that. So, I was a little disappointed honestly, to find that out. I really was hoping that it wouldn't be the case.
Because as you say, there are elements of, an understandable desire to find spirituality that's outside of these mainstream religions that have given women short shrift for a long time.
Right.
And, but it's not such a simple story of just like, yay, up with women. Like it's like goes to these really kind of bleak places. So casual practitioners of things, you mentioned yoga, meditation, maybe somebody who likes to collect crystals on their desk or have, some beliefs that are outside of what maybe medical science would say would, heal you or whatever. There are all of these different entry points to New Age thinking. Do you think that that's why it's become so popular, or what's behind its rise in popularity?
One thing that I really started to concentrate on were other times that New Age ideas really surged. So, like, even back in the 1800s, after the Civil War, there was a huge, huge surge of spiritualists and people claiming to be able to speak to the dead. There have been these moments in history where society was really fractured and people were really afraid. And I don't think it's a coincidence that New Age ideas surged in that time. And I think, bringing us up to now in 2020 with COVID, that's really where the genesis of this idea was for me, was seeing just so many gurus and health coaches and people selling crystals and, witchcraft like goods on Instagram and TikTok and things like that.
What about astrology? It's
I think
become so big too right
it's
now.
huge. It's huge. Right. Yeah. So, part of me was just personally interested in these ideas. I collect tarot decks. That's something that I think are really interesting. They have a really interesting art history, a lot of stigma around them that I think is kind of funny. But when I started to look into, the history of who pushes these items, when we're talking about things that are for sale, crystals, tarot cards, witchcraft goods, and things like that, I started to just kind of find that you can't really understand the modern New Age without understanding the roots of where these ideas started and come from. And, some of those ideas are really nasty.
So we're going to focus on two figures from your book in particular because of their ties to the Pacific Northwest. And first, I want to take this leader of a pro-Nazi group. It's called the Silver Legion of America. That group was founded in 1933. The organization's leader, William Dudley Pelley, ran for president in 1935, and the guy couldn't get on the ballot anywhere except in Washington state. What does his story, do you think, Leah, tell us about the early connections between New Age beliefs and fascism?
Yeah, I mean, Pelley's story is fascinating. So in the 1920s, he was a pretty successful writer. He was a part-time journalist, and he made his name within the silent film industry in Hollywood. But it was there that he really nurtured his anti-Semitism. The guy was he just was an unapologetic anti-Semite. So he tells this story that he had this profound either near-death experience or some kind of spiritual awakening in the late 1920s, where he started to hear voices afterwards. And he believed that he wrote a lot about this. He'd gained a huge following for writing so unapologetically about this kind of strange spiritual experience that he had. And he started hearing voices, and those voices told him he needed to start a Christian paramilitary organization, which, as you reference, is the Silver Shirts. I have written enough about militias and I've written enough about people who've had near-death experiences to always think it's kind of interesting how political these near-death experiences can be. Oftentimes, people have the same things told to them in their near-death experiences, which, as a journalist, obviously makes me very suspect if they're real or not. So, the Silver Shirts became really a pressure cooker for the far right in America as we know it now, which is, I think probably hard to believe this all happened in the 1930s. But the man who started the Aryan Nations in Idaho was a Silver Shirt. The man who started the Posse Comitatus movement, which is about sheriffs, was a Silver Shirt. So this is where, this movement began. It began in Washington state. And there were huge chapters of the silver shirts. The Chehalis silver shirts, for example, were featured in a huge, photographic spread in Life magazine for their embrace of fascism. Um, at one point, the Washington silver shirts specifically tried to make a plan to overthrow the government.
That was inevitable, yeah.
Didn't go so well for them, yeah. And Pelly was, tried and found guilty of sedition and put in prison. Afterwards, he couldn't publish his anti-Semitic writings like he had before. So he really rebranded himself as a spiritual guru, and he started this spiritual idea, I guess, called soulcraft, which draws from new age ideas and really puts this, within new age circles. You have a lot of thinkers who believe in something called masters. So almost like Catholic saints or something, like you can sort of speak to these masters. Well, Pelly takes the masters that lots of other New Age people had talked about, and he makes them Aryans. So, this is where, when you ask that question, it's like, it's a hard question to answer, because you have to understand what New Age thinkers believed and how people like Pelly, who were outright fascists, took those ideas and repackaged them. So there was an exclusionary element to it.
And you also point out, I think, that there were like some odd spiritual beliefs just in Nazism in general, like the belief that you could find, artifacts that would give you power, these Nazi leaders who would go on journeys to like try to uncover. I mean, it was Indiana Jones stuff, basically.
Right.
To, like, try to find the Ark of the Covenant. Yeah.
Right. When I saw that movie as a kid, I didn't know that there was some truth that these, Nazi expeditions had occurred in, the Himalayas and things like that.
I had no idea either. I thought that was a Steven Spielberg invention.
Totally. And it's weird, right? It's creepy when you realize that whole movements of people who are fascists went searching for some lost civilization where they would, find the Ark of the Covenant that would give them some sort of supposed power. Spoiler, they didn't find it.
Yeah. Thank goodness. You're listening to Soundside on KUOW. I'm Libby Dankman, and I'm talking with Leah Sottile, who is the author of a book called Blazing Eye Sees All. It's about the New Age movement in America, especially New Age groups rooted in the Pacific Northwest. So, Leah, I want to fast forward to closer to the present. We move from early 20th century, maybe mid 20th century, to the late 20th century, and this figure that you cover named J.Z. Knight. That's somebody who I have actually met before. Jay-Z and her spirit that she channels, a 35,000-year-old warrior named Ramtha. I'm going to get to my encounter with her in just a minute. But for anybody who has not heard of J.Z. Knight, and it is my favorite thing to tell new Seattleites, do you know about J.Z. Knight and the Ramtha School of Enlightenment? What is Jay-Z's story? How does she grow a following? What's the background there?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say one of the earliest reasons I wanted to write this book was living in the Pacific Northwest my whole life, knowing that there's this woman who channels a 35,000-year-old spirit and has a lot of people who believe in that.
And she lives there in Yelm.
And she's in Yelm.
A stone's throw away, yeah.
So I wanted to know that. So I did a ton of research and reporting into that. But essentially, she was born in the 1940s as Judy Hampton. She was lived in New Mexico. She was born in Roswell. And that, at that time, there was a lot of craze around UFOs, and specifically in Roswell. So she kind of grew up with this religious background, this UFOs in the air, and had a number of spiritual experiences herself. But really, the thing that's most important to know is that at a certain point, she moves north to Tacoma. And in 1977, she and her husband are really indulging in very popular ideas around pyramids at the time. There was this kind of craze called pyramidology, where people thought, pyramid-shaped things, if you put them over other things, it would improve that. So if you put a knife underneath a pyramid, the knife would become sharper, or whatever, food would become healthier. So, they're indulging in this. So she tells this story that one day she comes home and her husband has just built all these pyramids, all these paper pyramids. And so she gets in on the fun, and it's like 3 a.m. And so she puts a pyramid on her head, and, makes a big show of it. But when she takes the pyramid off her head, there is a very, very tall man glowing in her kitchen who she claims is Ramtha, this 35,000-year-old warrior spirit from the lost civilization of Lemuria. And ever since then, she has told a really interesting story. There are people who claim to be channelers, who channel spirits from other realms. But really, Ramtha and Jay-Z Knight, they've kind of merged into one entity. And so, people see Jay-Z Knight and they think Ramtha. It's this sort of interchangeable personality, but Ramtha takes over Jay-Z's body and she gives these long speeches and lectures and things like that. In the 1980s, she buys this massive ranch in Yelm and creates Ramtha's School of Enlightenment. And it became extremely popular with celebrities. Shirley MacLaine was one of her earliest followers and talked about the ways that Ramtha, enlightened her spiritually. So, that's been going ever since the 80s. And I think that there's been times when Ramtha's more well known than others, maybe not so much right now, but she's very famous, very popular, very wealthy around the world, known for her beliefs.
This is Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman, and my guest today is Leah Sottile. She's written a book about New Age groups, many of which have ties here in their origins to the Pacific Northwest. So, can I tell you the story about when I met Jay-Z
Yes.
and Ramtha?
I can't wait.
Okay, so this all came back after I was reading your book. So I met her once or twice around 2007. I was a producer at a radio station called KUOW here in Seattle, and she would like to come on the show that I produced called The Dave Ross Show. And Dave would once in a while get an email from her and said, can I come on the show? And her people and her would kind of sweep into the station, and she would come in all of her glory, like, really cool, different kind of outfits, flowy stuff. And she would have her hair really done up and she's just a striking personality. Like people who haven't seen videos of her, gorgeous woman. And then, if you've seen her channel Ramtha, she puts on this really masculine voice and a kind of an accent. But by the time I met her in 2007, she wasn't doing that. She wasn't really channeling Ramtha, at least for us. Apparently, and this jived with what you were writing in the book. She had started to kind of move away from just doing that channeling all the time, and Jay-Z herself was having more of a voice and more of pontificating on things. So she would just come in and talk about current events. But then one time she brought 2 kids from the school and they performed psychic feats on the radio. They would take, something on a piece of paper and they would try to guess what was on the piece of paper.
Right.
Or
right.
Dave would hold something behind his back and they would guess what was behind his back, which I guess is really along the lines with the kind of things that they were doing on the ranch, according to what you've, dug up in your reporting.
Right.
I don't know, it just seemed like a very fascinating thing at the time. And one time, one of the kids did guess what was behind Dave's back. It was an eraser in his hand, but it kind of shook us all. We were like, oh my gosh, the kid is psychic.
Yeah.
And, you've written that this kind of expectation of people just channeling their psychic energies, that's something that happened on the ranch, right?
Absolutely. And it's interesting this specific thing that you're saying that she was sort of performing with these children on the radio. I don't know if you've heard this podcast, the telepathy tapes, but it's
No.
Everybody is talking about this podcast. And it's about, to make a very long story short, it's about, children that can telepathically communicate with their parents and guess numbers and colors and things just like that. When I heard that show, I couldn't help but think of it as just, a new iteration of a new age idea that we have these spiritual and kind of extra cognitive gifts that we just need to nurture. And I think that that's very much the vibe of some of the things that people can learn at Ramtha School of Enlightenment. It's there are exercises where people are blindfolded and they go through a maze and they kind of feel their way through. Or, famously, there's this one exercise where everybody's blindfolded in a really big field and they have a note card with their kind of wishes that they've written, and they've put pinned to a fence. And so they have to find their way to their note card and use their kind of spiritual and telepathic energy to bring them there. And some people find it, and I don't know that anything really happens, but I think that's really what Jay-Z Night has been about, is kind of selling this idea that there's like more to life than people want you to know. I think the other thing about Jay-Z Night that we have to talk about, though, is that within the last 10 years, she's really stopped doing interviews. And this happened after, audio leaked of her spouting off anti-Semitic ideas. She's become super into QAnon. All kinds of hate funneled at a lot of different groups. And I think that that's sort of this, she's a part of this trend that I find in the book of female leaders, really claiming power for themselves, but then always kind of going in this direction that's really apocalyptic and conspiratorial.
Yeah, and I should be clear that the tapes where she went on this anti-Semitic rant, those leaked after she would come on the show, and I would imagine that they would not, that would not occur anymore.
Yeah. I think that was surprising for a lot of people, though, because I think that there were a lot of very progressive people who would go to Ramtha School of Enlightenment and have a retreat for a weekend and listen to what she had to say. To hear her kind of go in that direction, I think did feel slightly out of left field for a lot of people.
It did interest me, though, that overlap between QAnon and her turn towards being a Trump supporter, and sort of the way that New Age kind of make America healthy again, that internet milieu has been looped in with Trump support, and how the president has kind of been able to tap into a blend of like political persuasion, but also spiritualism. I mean, when you watch what is going on, not just with Jay-Z, but with other New Age leaders and Trumpism, where do you think the connection is?
Yeah, I think that one thing that's really common within new agey spaces is sort of like creating a different alternative reality for some people. Or maybe a better way to say it would be, we don't need these institutions that have kept us all down in some way, whether that's the education system or the healthcare system, or, name your thing. So I think that that's where, people within this new age movement that you might think would be otherwise pretty progressive have found common cause with the far right, with this far left and far right kind of meet, that horseshoe analogy a lot of people like to make. So I think that's one thing. But within New Age circles for, decades upon decades, there's always been some sort of like health element to it. A lot of the people I write about in my book, push a certain kind of diet or a certain kind of, exercise regimen, or, a sort of disturbing amount of colonics and things like that. So,
well, and Amy Carlson, when she died, the mother god figure in the Colorado group, she had all the silver in her system that was like changing her skin color to the point where, she had turned kind of a tinged grayish blue.
Right. Yeah. And colloidal silver is a substance that has been sold, I would say, just as equally within kind of hippie circles and prepper circles. And, with Amy Carlson, that group was creating that substance. It's a really crude substance made from batteries, but essentially people within, kind of crunchier Maha circles think of that as a cure-all. And it, in Amy's case, it poisoned her. So, I think what people are seeking there is some sort of alternative, that they can't trust doctors, they can't trust scientists and institutions. So, in the long tail of COVID, you can understand why these groups would have this surge, because we saw so much of that skepticism in that time.
And there's something so attractive about that idea that you've discovered the secret that other people don't want you to find. And I think that that's something that's common in those in Trumpism, but also, the QAnon, the kind of further out fringe stuff that translates to Trumpism, but then also the New Age beliefs. Before we move on from Jay-Z Night and the Ramtha School of Enlightenment in Yelm, I mean, you did talk to some former followers there. what did you hear from them about the effects of the school on them?
It was pretty across the board. The people that I spoke to shared stories of real destruction. And the people that I think were the most profound that I spoke to were several people who were there as children. Their parents were really into what Jay-Z was selling. And, just to be clear, not a lot of people live there. It's just that you would go for these big weekends of classes and workshops and things like that. Um, a lot of these folks, struggled with addiction issues really young. A big part of what Ramtha School of Enlightenment has historically done are these wine ceremonies where everyone drinks, including children. So there were some addiction issues. There was a real skepticism of institutions and a really a lot of people who avoided seeking higher education because they thought, well, what do I need more education for? The world's going to end and we're going to be, ascend to the next dimension or whatever. So there was a lot of harm there in unplugging what people thought was actually real and what were agreed upon truths. And I thought that that was really fascinating as a journalist, but also really complex and understanding, what harm really looks like when it comes to spiritual harm.
And I know you tried to get in touch with Jay-Z Knight to have a conversation. What happened when you tried to get in touch? And if you could have interviewed her, what would you have wanted to ask?
Yeah, I was never allowed to speak to her directly. I did speak to some of her deputies and was encouraged to sign a lot of forms that would say that I wouldn't talk about whatever I talked about with the people at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. As a journalist, we don't sign forms giving away what we can say. And so that initially made me really skeptical. I made several requests because I felt like I'd read a lot of Jay-Z Knight's books. I really felt like I understood where her place was in the lineage of the New Age, and it didn't seem it didn't matter that I wanted to have what I thought would be an elevated conversation.
Just to close us out here, you're looking at a number of these movements, from the Fox sisters in the 1800s to the Love Is One group in Colorado, and you're finding a lot of the similar characteristics. And unfortunately, along with a lot of the positive life-affirming stuff and the optimism, there are these dark strains. Anti-Semitism seems to come up again and again. Homophobia is also rampant, unfortunately, in a lot of these movements. Why do you think that occurs when the group is supposed to be about love and, self-acceptance or self-growth? Why do you think that these strains of hate still exist in these groups?
I think it's because that's where the roots of it are. I think if you have an idea that is, back in the 1850s, this prominent, author of many New Age ideas that we have today was talking about races in terms of a hierarchy and was placing the white race at the very top as the most supreme. So I don't know. I think that, I've written about extremism long enough to know you can't really remove that piece and say, like, these ideas of love and light, sure, they're a great idea, but why is there this racial element there? I think that it's also really important to say the New Age movement is huge, and there are many people talking about these ideas in ways that I'm sure are not destructive. But I do think it is very suspect that there have been so many prominent groups led by women professing these same ideas, changing and repackaging them for the political times, that have become very financially successful, very powerful politically. As somebody who is interested in alternative ways of thinking and living my life, that was important for me to know.
In your reporting, did you ever come down on an understanding of whether these situations, these groups were a scam, a true belief, potentially mental illness, writ large and being used in a, nefarious way? Like Amy Carlson's family believed that she was probably suffering from mental illness. Did you come to a conclusion, or did you, kind of want to explore that more? I didn't see like much in the book in terms of like, are these people frankly mentally ill, or do they really believe it, or is it just a money-making scam?
It's a question that I ask myself over and over between this book and the book that I wrote before this, which is about Mormonism and kind of the extreme fringes of that faith. One thing that I think I've learned over the years writing about religion is that it almost is irrelevant to question whether or not somebody's spiritual belief is real or not. Because if it's real to them, then there's really no proving otherwise. I think the only person who could say if Jay-Z Knight actually saw Ramtha in her kitchen was her husband at that time, who I believe is no longer alive. Um, but also Ramtha only appears to Jay-Z. So you could be in the room with her and she would be the only person that would see him. So I think that if that's mental illness, I'm not sure. I haven't had anybody tell me that directly. However, there is a big scammy element to all of these groups. I talk a lot about this group in the 1930s called the I Am activity and how they really grifted people and sold snake oil cures and said it was spirituality, and that was something that was interrogated in and out of the courts up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, we can't decide whether or not somebody's spiritual beliefs are real or not. That's not our job, and we don't want it to be. So it's a long answer of saying that there are really scammy elements to these things. And I think that's where people need to be really careful in terms of who they farm out their spiritual decisions to.
Leah Sottile is a journalist based in the Pacific Northwest, and she is the author of Blazing Eyes Sees All, Love Has Won, False Prophets, and The Fever Dream of the American New Age. I really enjoyed the read, Leah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.